Episode 6, The Great Depression and the Death of Orthodoxy. So by 1930, the party was over. The stock tickers were silent, bread lines stretched for blocks, and the world's most powerful economy, of course the United States, was flat on its back. This was not supposed to happen. According to every classical economist, markets self-correct. The invisible hand, right? Supply meets demand, confidence returns, and that lovely invisible hand fixes everything. But this time, the invisible hand was clenched in a fist. The old rules didn't work anymore, and as the Great Depression deepened, the world's leaders clung to economic orthodoxy long after it had failed. Herbert Hoover entered office in 1929 as one of the most capable men to ever hold a presidency. He was a self-made millionaire, mere humanitarian, and he was the Secretary of Commerce, and he truly believed in efficiency and optimism. So when the market crashed, Hoover's instincts told him to just reassure everyone, not intervene. All of his quotes kind of come back to the same thing. The fundamentals of the economy are sound, he said. But the problem is that fundamentals don't feed families. Within a year, unemployment hit 8% in the United States, but then it hit 15 and then it hit 25. Again, for context on this, I think at the height of COVID, we were around 10%. So factories shuttered, banks failed, families lost homes and farms, and Hoover clung to the same belief that had guided the 1920s, the Roaring '20s. Markets correct themselves and government must not distort them. He saw intervention as moral hazard, and the result was just paralysis. And we've seen this before. If you listen to the podcast, we did an interview with a gentleman who wrote a book on the Irish potato famine, and there were the same arguments around moral hazard from the British. If we give these people handouts or we feed them, they're just gonna stop working and they're gonna become reliant on us and aren't gonna do anything to take care of themselves. And we've seen this argument throughout history. So you have that attitude colliding with, we as humans are all a product of our background and what we've been through. And so somebody like Herbert Hoover, very successful businessman, his experience has always been that we just work our way through things. And he, the proverbial I, as in Herbert Hoover, he's always worked through things. He's always found success. It's just grit and determination will get us through this. And he's a product of that because it's always worked out for him. And so he takes what he's been through and what he's accomplished as an individual, and he applies it to the entire nation. We'll just figure it out, pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. And this doesn't work. So before we come back to Hoover, let's just go back across the Atlantic to our other central bankers who are all facing various degrees of their own reckoning. As we know, Strong in the United States, the chairman of the New York Federal Reserve, has passed away, so he's not seeing any of this. But we've got Montague Norman in London, and he is still This is a theme. We say this almost every episode. He's still doubling down on austerity and just defending the gold standard at all costs, even as Britain's economy is suffocating. So at the very moment when they need liquidity and they need to go off the gold standard and just start printing money, he's doubling down on defending the pound and returning Britain to its former place of glory and respect on the national stage. Then we have Emile Moreau in Paris, who continues to be obsessed with hoarding as much gold as possible. And in some ways, France does benefit from this. They were in a very weak position entering the war, or excuse me, exiting the war. They actually are doing better than these other countries as the Great Depression hits, but he's starving the international system of liquidity. Again, crises, we need liquidity in the system. In Paris or France and Moreau are just hoarding all the gold and keeping it out of the system. And then we got Hjalmar Schacht in Germany, who they have obviously been in a horrible position since the war ended, and the Great Depression isn't making things any better. But he's pretty much out of cards to play. He's sidelined at this point, as Germany's banks are they're just collapsing left and right under the weight of all that foreign debt. Remember that circular arrangement where Germany borrows from the US to pay Britain and France reparations, who then pay the US. The house of cards is coming down. So without coordinated policy or flexible money, i.e. going off the gold standard, the Depression metastasized from an American crisis into a total global collapse. And one economist later quipped, the gold standard was a golden fetter, binding nations to the corpse of deflation. So deflation is a slow death. Prices fall, businesses cut wages to survive, consumers delay purchases, waiting for things to get cheaper. Demand we talk about an inflation spiral in the modern day. We keep spending more because we're worried prices are going to go up, and then your companies pay people more, and it just creates this spiral where everybody gets paid more, spends more. This is the opposite. We're going in the other direction, where wages are getting cut and everybody assumes prices are going to keep going down, so they don't buy anything, which of course slows economic activity, GDP, and it's a death spiral. So by 1932, industrial production, remember, we're an industrial economy. There's no tech sector. Like, everybody's working in factories, making Model Ts, all that kind of stuff. Industrial production in the US had fallen by half. That is staggering. World trade shrank by 2/3. And in cities, thousands of unemployed men sold apples on street corners. And in rural America, dust storms swallowed farms whole. We talked about this. There's a great book by Timothy Egan called The Worst Hard Time, and it's all about this. And part of it went back to government subsidies that incentivized farmers to just farm the hell out of this land in the Great Plains, which ultimately destroyed the land and created these Dust Bowl conditions. And the Depression, this was already happening, but the Depression only made that worse, of course. And so economics had failed to explain or fix the humans' suffering. The orthodoxy said just cut spending, balance budgets, and defend the currency. But at the end of the day, people can't eat balanced budgets. I mean, we saw the opposite of this, right? I keep going back to COVID or even the great financial crisis. When these crises hit, we just printed money. We did the opposite of what was happening here. These leaders, they're sitting on their hands just waiting for the forces of the free market, the invisible hand, to basically fix everything. The idea is if we just stick to the script, free markets are the solution to all problems. And that's just not the case. And we've seen in modern day, maybe we've gone too far with it, right? Printing trillions of dollars when we have a crisis, but I'll take that. At the end of the day, I will take that over what happened in 1929, of course, and we did learn something from this. So in the middle of all this, a British economist by the name of John Maynard Keynes, super famous now, he was not at the time, began to challenge the kind of sacred texts of all the classical economics. And his, at the time, radical idea was simple, but it was revolutionary. And the idea was simply that sometimes markets don't self-correct. In times of panic, only government spending, i.e., deficits, can restart the engine. And you'll hear this today. You'll hear people talk about Keynesian economics. It's a way of describing people who believe in running deficits and government intervention. And like most things, there's a happy medium to it. Our deficit is probably too high right now, but running zero deficit can also be problematic, particularly when you need to stimulate an economy, which we certainly did in 1929, 1930, 1931. So in 31, Keynes wrote, the world is ruled by little else than ideas. Think about that. But he also warned that outdated ideas, like the gold standard, could drag civilization down with them. So the gold standard, it's this idea that's been around forever. It keeps if a pound or a dollar is worth I don't know what the conversion is, but a 1,000th of an ounce of gold, at least tomorrow you wake up and you know your dollar is still worth $1. And it makes a lot of sense. It's easy to conceptualize in your head, but it's one of those things that had just always been that way. It made sense to people, but it was not the solution to a new problem like this, a new crisis that we hadn't been through, like the Great Depression. So Keynes, at first he was ignored, but by the end of the decade, Keynes' ideas would reshape the world and the way that we think about economics in America and, throughout the globe. So Hoover, back to him. Optimism, or maybe cautious optimism, curdled into despair. In 1932, a journalist described Washington, D.C., as a city of ghosts. Here's what he meant by that. Protesters, many of them veterans of World War I, marched on the Capitol demanding the bonuses they'd been promised. And what did Hoover do? Hoover ordered the army to clear them out. So Americans watched as tanks rolled down Pennsylvania Avenue against our own soldiers. The symbolism, just imagine the symbolism of this. It's devastating. I mean, these people, many of them they'd all put their lives on the line serving their country and defeating Germany and the other enemies in World War I. Went overseas. Many of them, are casualties, have injuries from the war, have PTSD, etc. They gave up everything for their country, and the bonuses they were supposed to get, not only did they not receive them, but they went to the Capitol and got cleared out by the army. They had tanks turned against the very soldiers who defended our way of life in America and went overseas and served their country. So the free market orthodoxy had failed. The gold standard had failed. And at this point, even democracy itself seems fragile. So out of this wreckage rose new leaders with new ideas. We know when there is unrest or things are not going well, that's an opportune time for new leaders, both good and bad, to rise, or some might say, take advantage of the situation. When things are going great, everybody's happy. Generally, maybe not as much in 2025. Everybody seems pretty pissed off a lot of the time. But back then, everybody's happy. There's not room for someone to come forward and offer new ideas. But when things are going poorly, people look to a new leader for answers. So in the United States, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, promised a New Deal, and we'll talk about that more. And in Britain, economists, Keynes being the leader of this group, began to rethink money and employment and the entire idea of how economies work. Okay, so those are maybe positives, but elsewhere, darker forces offered much simpler answers. In Germany, Adolf Hitler promised jobs and revenge. Okay, we know all about that story, but it's a tale as old as time. People are unhappy. You find a scapegoat. You tell everybody that you're the answer. You're going to fix everything. And that's how autocracies rise. That's how dictators rise, is by people are down and out and they offer a simple solution. Let's blame the Jews. And by the way, I'm going to fix everything. I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I'm just going to fix it because I'm me and I know how to do it. So in Germany, we have Hitler. And then in Italy, we have Mussolini, who's promising order. Remember, Italy is not in a great place either, so they are vulnerable to a leader like Mussolini, who's a, classic tough guy. El Duce was his nickname. And he's if you've read any biographies or anything on Mussolini, he's a horrendous person. He has a history of violence, raping women, etc. And we've seen this again throughout history. History repeats itself. And Sometimes when a country is down and out or people are upset, they look to a tough guy. Even if he's an awful human being, I just want a guy who's gonna go in there and he's gonna take some names and kick some ass. I don't really care how he does it. I just want somebody that's gonna change things up. So the thing to keep in mind here, you'll hear people say like things like, stay out of politics, keep the economy and politics separate. That's ridiculous, because when economic systems fail, people don't just lose money, they lose faith. They lose faith in institutions such as their government or their tax system, or anything that is a pillar of society sometimes comes into question when people lose faith. And faith always finds a replacement, often in the form of these dictators or strongmen. So the Great Depression wasn't just a financial crisis. It was a crisis of imagination. The old world died because leaders simply couldn't imagine anything else. They worshiped the balance sheet when they should have been serving people. You look out imagine looking at a balance sheet, oh, we got to balance the budget. We got to let the free market work. And you look out the window and there's people selling apples on the corner and there's tents everywhere. But this is just how the world was at the time. People were stuck in their ways. And it's just a case of, this is how things have always been. We don't want to change them. So when orthodoxy becomes ideology, it stops being useful. The hardest part of leadership isn't knowing the rules, it's knowing when to break them. So in our next episode, we'll explore the recovery, how Roosevelt's New Deal and global rearmament reshaped capitalism, and how the financial world's lessons from the Depression shaped the post-war order.